Sir, please stand up.
May I ask what this is about?
You've been reported for threatening the crew.
I haven't threatened anyone. I don't know what you're talking about.
He doesn't belong up here.
I have a valid ticket. I belong here.
Turn around, please.
I'm not sure why this is happening.
Hands behind your back. Now.
Judge Allison preferred quiet travel. The International Judicial Conference in Geneva had ended 2 days earlier, and most of the delegates had already scattered across Europe for private meetings or sightseeing before returning home. Allison had done neither. After delivering his closing remarks on international legal cooperation, he packed his notes, thanked the organizers, and headed straight for the airport. At 52 years old, he had spent nearly 3 decades inside courtrooms where every word mattered and every decision carried consequences. The conference had been productive. Long discussions about cross-border cybercrime, extradition policy, and the growing pressure national courts faced in a world where laws struggled to keep pace with technology. But by the time the final panel concluded, Allison was ready to go home. He moved through the Frankfurt airport the same way he approached most things in life, calmly, efficiently, and without drawing attention. His grey suit jacket hung neatly over his shoulders, his blue tie loosened slightly from the long day of travel. In one hand he carried a slim leather briefcase containing conference notes, legal documents, and the draft of a speech he planned to deliver once he returned to Washington. Most of the people walking through the terminal had no idea who he was. That was exactly how he preferred it. The boarding call for Atlantic Pacific Flight 471 to Washington Dulles echoed across the gate area just after sunset. First-class passengers were invited to board first. Allison stepped forward with the small group that gathered near the gate scanner. He handed over his boarding pass, offered the agent a polite nod, and walked down the jet bridge without saying much else. Inside the aircraft cabin, the familiar quiet of first class greeted him. Soft lighting glowed from the overhead panels. Wide seats lined each side of the aisle. A few early passengers were already settling in, stowing bags and adjusting seatbelts. Allison found seat 3A beside the window. He placed his briefcase under the seat, sat down, and looked out at the darkening runway while ground crews moved equipment beneath the wings. For a moment he allowed himself to relax. 16 hours earlier he had been standing behind a podium discussing international judicial cooperation. Now he was simply another passenger on a long flight home. He pulled a book from his briefcase, a worn hardcover he had been slowly working through during the trip, and opened it across his lap. Outside the window, airport lights reflected against the glass as boarding continued. Behind him, farther back in the cabin, a young flight attendant watched the line of passengers entering the aircraft. Her name was Emily Carter, and she had been flying international routes for nearly 4 years. She prided herself on maintaining control of the cabin, noticing details others might miss, and keeping everything running smoothly from takeoff to landing. As each traveler stepped aboard, she glanced briefly at them out of habit. Business travelers, tourists, families with children. But when the man in the grey suit walked past her toward the first-class section, something about him caught her attention. It wasn't anything obvious. He wasn't loud. He wasn't disruptive. In fact, he barely said a word. Yet Emily found herself watching him longer than the others. She noticed the neat beard, the composed posture, the quiet way he carried himself as he moved toward the front rows. Seat 3A. She glanced down at the digital passenger manifest on the small galley screen. Allison, Marcus. She frowned slightly. Most first-class passengers on international routes fit a certain profile. Corporate executives, diplomats, frequent travelers who had earned upgrades through years of flying. This passenger didn't immediately fit the picture she had in mind. Emily looked up again. Through the gap between seats she could see him settling by the window, already opening a book as if the long flight had barely begun. The cabin continued filling around him. A businessman in a navy blazer took the aisle seat across from him. A middle-aged couple claimed the row behind. A woman wearing large headphones sat 2 rows forward and began scrolling through her phone. None of them paid much attention to the man in seat 3A. But Emily did. From the galley, she watched him quietly for a moment longer before turning back to the rest of the boarding passengers. It was probably nothing. Still, the small question lingered in her mind. As the last passengers boarded and the aircraft door closed, the captain's voice came over the intercom welcoming everyone aboard for the overnight flight to Washington. Seatbelts clicked into place. Luggage bins shut. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. Allison turned another page in his book. A few minutes later, Emily began preparing for the first beverage service. She and another attendant rolled the service cart into the aisle and began moving row by row through the cabin. "Something to drink before takeoff?" she asked the passenger in seat 1A. "Sparkling water." Row 2 requested orange juice. Across the aisle, a man ordered whiskey. Emily nodded politely and continued down the aisle. When she reached row 3, she paused briefly. Judge Allison looked up from his book. For a split second their eyes met. Then Emily moved past him. The cart continued rolling down the aisle. 2 rows later, the businessman across from Allison shifted slightly in his seat, glancing toward the window row. He had noticed something odd. Everyone else in first class had received a drink, except the man in seat 3A. Allison didn't react. He simply turned another page in his book, as if the small oversight meant nothing at all. But from the galley, Emily looked back toward him again, and the quiet suspicion in her mind grew just a little stronger. Boarding had finished and the aircraft door closed with a heavy mechanical thud that echoed faintly through the cabin. Outside the window, runway lights stretched across the darkening horizon while ground crews moved away from the aircraft. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere settled into the quiet rhythm of a long international flight preparing for departure. Judge Marcus Allison sat by the window in seat 3A, his posture relaxed, his attention focused on the book resting open in his lap. The pages moved slowly beneath his fingers as he read, occasionally pausing to glance out the window at the fading skyline of Frankfurt Airport. He had always found something calming about the moment before takeoff, the brief pause when hundreds of people sat together in the same space, waiting for the same journey to begin. Across the aisle, a businessman in a navy blazer typed quickly on a laptop. A couple behind Allison spoke softly to each other while adjusting their blankets. The rest of the passengers settled into their seats, preparing for the overnight crossing. Near the front galley, Emily Carter watched the cabin. At first, it had been nothing more than a passing glance when the man boarded. But something about him continued pulling her attention back toward row 3. She looked again toward the manifest screen mounted beside the galley. Seat 3A. Allison. Marcus. She stuttered the name for a moment. Then she glanced back into the cabin. The man in question looked perfectly composed where he sat by the window, turning the page of his book with quiet patience. Still, Emily felt an uneasiness she couldn't quite explain. She leaned slightly toward her fellow attendant, Daniel, who was organizing cups on the beverage cart. "Row 3, she said quietly. "Window seat." Daniel followed her gaze briefly before shrugging. "What about him?" "I just want to double-check his boarding pass." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "He already boarded." "I know," she said. "Just check." Daniel hesitated for a moment before stepping into the aisle and walking towards seat 3A. Judge Allison noticed him approaching but remained seated. "Sir," Daniel said politely, offering a small smile, "would you mind showing me your boarding pass for a quick verification?" Allison looked up, mildly surprised but not offended. "Of course." He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out the folded boarding pass. Daniel glanced down at it. Seat 3A. Marcus Allison. Everything matched perfectly. "Thank you, sir," Daniel said, handing it back. "No problem," Allison replied calmly before returning his attention to the book. Daniel walked back to the galley. "It's fine," he said quietly. Emily barely looked up. "They mess up seating sometimes," she muttered. Daniel frowned slightly. "He's in the right seat." Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced down the aisle again. Allison sat exactly where he had been moments earlier, quietly reading as if the interruption had never happened. Still, something about the situation bothered her. In her mind, the picture didn't line up the way she expected. First-class passengers usually carried themselves differently. They spoke to the crew more often, ordered drinks quickly, made small talk. This passenger seemed distant, quiet, watching. Emily folded her arms loosely across her uniform jacket as she continued observing him from the galley. A few minutes later, the aircraft began taxiing. The engines hummed louder beneath the cabin floor as the massive jet rolled toward the runway. Passengers adjusted their seats while the safety announcement played overhead. Allison placed a small bookmark inside his book and closed it, resting it neatly on the tray table. Outside the window, runway lights blurred as the aircraft turned into position. Then came the roar of acceleration. The aircraft surged forward, pressing passengers gently into their seats as it lifted into the night sky. For the next 20 minutes, The cabin lights dimmed and the flight settled into its cruising rhythm. Emily prepared for the next round of service. But her attention kept drifting back to row 3. Ellison sat quietly, hands folded together now as he looked out the window at the dark ocean stretching beneath the plane. He hadn't pressed the call button, hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't asked for anything. And somehow, that silence only made Emily more uneasy. Eventually she walked down the aisle again, stopping beside his seat. "Sir," she said. Ellison looked up politely. "Yes." "Are you sure you're seated in the correct cabin?" For the first time since boarding, the question caught him off guard. He blinked once, confused. "My boarding pass says 3A. Emily gave a thin, professional smile. "Yes, I'm aware. I just wanted to confirm." Ellison nodded slowly. "I believe everything is correct." Across the aisle, the businessman with a laptop quietly glanced up from his screen. He had heard the exchange, and he didn't miss the tone in the flight attendant's voice. Emily lingered for a moment longer before turning and walking back toward the galley. From behind, several passengers watched her go. Then they looked toward the quiet man sitting by the window. Ellison reopened his book without saying another word. But now the cabin felt slightly different. The small moment had planted something in the air, an uneasiness that hadn't been there before. And from the galley, Emily Carter continued watching seat 3A as if she were waiting for something to happen. The cabin had settled into the quiet rhythm of a long overnight flight. Most of the passengers in first class had begun relaxing after takeoff. Some reclined their seats. Others scrolled through movies on the entertainment screens mounted in front of them. A few travelers had already wrapped themselves in blankets, preparing to sleep through the long crossing over the Atlantic. Judge Marcus Ellison remained seated by the window in seat 3A, the small reading light above him casting a soft glow over the open book resting in his hands. Outside, the world was nothing but darkness and distant clouds illuminated by the moon. Inside, the aircraft hummed steadily as it climbed toward cruising altitude. The service cart rolled slowly down the aisle again. Emily Carter moved with practiced efficiency, offering drinks and small plates of appetizers to the passengers in the first rows. Her smile appeared easily for some travelers, her voice warm and conversational. "Sparkling water." "Another whiskey for you, sir." "Of course, I'll bring that right away." She stopped at each seat with polite attention. But when the cart reached row 3, something subtle shifted. Emily slowed slightly, glancing toward seat 3A. Judge Ellison looked up briefly as the cart stopped beside his row. For a moment it appeared she might address him. Instead, she turned to the passenger across the aisle. "Would you like another drink, sir?" The businessman nodded. "Yes, please. Scotch." Emily poured the drink carefully, placing the glass on his tray table before continuing down the aisle. She never spoke to Ellison. Across the row, the businessman hesitated slightly before accepting the drink. He glanced toward the quiet passenger by the window. Ellison had noticed, but he didn't react. He simply turned another page in his book. Behind them, the couple seated in row 4 exchanged a quiet glance. The woman leaned slightly toward her husband. "Did she skip him?" she whispered. Her husband nodded slowly. "Looks like it." Up near the galley, Emily parked the service cart and began organizing cups and bottles with short, precise movements. But her eyes drifted back toward the cabin. Seat 3A. The passenger still sat there reading calmly, showing no signs of frustration or discomfort. To Emily, that calmness felt strange. Most passengers would have said something by now. Pressed the call button. Asked for service. He hadn't done any of that. Instead, he remained completely composed. Watching. Waiting. The longer she observed him, the more convinced she became that something about the situation wasn't right. "Daniel," she said quietly to the other attendant. He looked up from stacking trays. "What?" "That passenger in row 3. Daniel sighed softly. "Again." "Just keep an eye on him." Daniel glanced briefly down the aisle. Ellison was now looking out the window again, his book resting closed on the tray table. "He's just sitting there," Daniel said. "I know." "That's not a problem." Emily folded her arms across her uniform jacket. "It might be." A few rows away, another passenger had begun watching the exchange between the attendants in the galley. A young woman seated near the front quietly lifted her phone, pretending to check messages while she observed the cabin. Something about the atmosphere had shifted. Small moments were beginning to stand out. The skipped service. The repeated glances from the crew. The quiet scrutiny directed toward the man in seat 3A. None of it was loud or obvious. But passengers were starting to notice. Ellison, however, seemed uninterested in the tension building around him. He reopened his book and continued reading, occasionally adjusting his glasses as the aircraft moved gently through pockets of air. His calm demeanor only deepened Emily's suspicion. She had spent years working flights. She believed she could read people well. And something about the passenger silence felt calculated to her. Eventually, she stepped into the forward galley and reached for the small intercom panel connected to the cockpit. She hesitated for a moment. Then she pressed the call button. A soft beep sounded. "Captain," she said quietly when the line opened. "Yes," came the pilot's voice. "There's a passenger in first class I'd like you to be aware of." There was a short pause. What kind of issue? Emily glanced down the aisle again. Seat 3A remained perfectly still. The man sat by the window, reading quietly while the cabin lights dimmed around him. "I'm not sure yet," she said slowly, "but his behavior seems unusual." Up in the cockpit, the captain listened carefully. What exactly has he done? Emily hesitated. "Nothing specific," she admitted. "But something feels off." The captain was silent for a moment. "Keep observing," he said finally. "Let me know if anything changes." Emily ended the call and returned her attention to the cabin. The quiet man in seat 3A turned another page in his book. Several passengers watched the crew with growing curiosity. And somewhere in the back of the aircraft, someone quietly opened their phone camera, just in case something worth recording happened. The quiet inside the cabin began to feel heavier. At cruising altitude, the aircraft hummed steadily as it pushed through the dark sky over the Atlantic. Most passengers had settled into the long overnight routine, reading, watching movies, or drifting slowly toward sleep. But in the forward galley, Emily Carter could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her eyes returned again and again to row 3. Seat 3A. Judge Marcus Ellison remained exactly where he had been since takeoff, sitting calmly beside the window, reading his book beneath the small overhead light. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't requested service. He hadn't even moved much. To most people, that would have looked like an ordinary passenger enjoying a quiet flight. To Emily, it looked suspicious. She watched him for several minutes from the galley, replaying small moments in her mind. The quiet boarding. The calm reaction when his boarding pass had been checked. The way he seemed completely unbothered when she had passed his seat during drink service. Something about the calmness bothered her. In her experience, people who had something to hide often tried too hard to appear relaxed. She stepped toward the small cabin phone again and pressed the intercom. The cockpit responded quickly. "Captain speaking." "It's Emily in first class again," she said quietly. "What's going on?" "I'm still concerned about the passenger in 3A." There was a pause on the line. "You said earlier he hadn't done anything." "He hasn't," she replied. "But he's acting unusual." "What do you mean by unusual?" Emily looked toward the cabin again. Ellison was now staring out the window, the reflection of cabin lights faint against the glass. "He's been watching the cabin a lot," she said. "That's not unusual on a flight." "I know," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "But something doesn't feel right." Up in the cockpit, the captain considered her words carefully. Airlines trained crew members to report anything that felt abnormal, especially on long international flights. Still, reports without specific behavior were difficult to act on. "Keep monitoring," the captain said cautiously. "If anything changes, let me know." Emily ended the call, but the concern in her mind had already begun turning into certainty. She turned to Daniel again. "I think we should notify security." Daniel looked up immediately. "Security? He's making me uncomfortable." Daniel glanced toward row 3. Ellison had reopened his book again. "He's literally reading," Daniel said. "I know what I see," Emily replied quietly. Several rows away, passengers had begun noticing the repeated glances from the crew. The businessman across from Ellison leaned back in his seat, pretending to scroll through his laptop while observing the situation. Something clearly wasn't normal. The flight attendants kept whispering in the galley. They kept looking toward the same passenger, and the man in seat 3A seemed completely unaware or unconcerned. Emily stepped away from the galley again and walked slowly down the aisle. When she reached Ellison's seat, she stopped beside him. "Sir," she said. Ellison looked up politely. "Yes. Can I ask what the purpose of your trip is today?" The question hung awkwardly in the air. Across the aisle, the businessman froze mid-keystroke. Ellison blinked once, clearly surprised. "I was attending a conference," he said calmly. "What kind of conference?" "A legal conference." Emily studied his face carefully, as if searching for something. "Where?" "Geneva." "And you're traveling alone?" "Yes." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. Then she nodded stiffly and walked away. Behind her, several passengers exchanged confused looks. The questioning had felt strange, unnecessary, but Emily no longer trusted her instincts to stay silent. Back in the galley, she picked up the secure airline communication handset and connected to the airline's ground operations channel. Her voice lowered. "I need to report a potentially suspicious passenger in first class." The operator on the other end responded immediately. "What is the nature of the concern?" Emily glanced once more towards seat 3A. The man she was reporting had already returned to his book, turning the page slowly as if nothing had happened. "I believe the passenger may pose a potential security risk," she said. Several minutes passed. Passengers continued their quiet activities while the aircraft cut through the night sky. Then something changed. From the rear of the cabin, two men began walking slowly up the aisle. They wore plain clothes, dark jackets, neutral expressions, but anyone familiar with air travel could recognize them instantly. Federal Air Marshals. They moved quietly through the cabin until they reached the first-class section. Then they stopped beside seat 3A. Ellison looked up from his book. One of the marshals spoke calmly. "Sir, we need you to stand up." The cabin went completely silent. Passengers looked up from their screens. Heads turned. Ellison closed his book slowly. "May I ask why?" he said calmly. "You've been reported as a potential security concern." For the first time since the flight began, a ripple of tension moved through the cabin. Phones began appearing in passengers' hands. Across the aisle, the businessman stared in disbelief. Ellison remained seated for one quiet second longer. Then he sighed softly and stood. "I assure you," he said calmly, "this is a misunderstanding." But the marshals were already reaching for their handcuffs. And several rows back, Emily Carter watched the scene unfold, completely certain she had just prevented something dangerous. The moment Judge Marcus Ellison stood up, the entire first-class cabin seemed to freeze. Passengers who had been half asleep were suddenly wide awake. Laptop screens paused mid-document. Movie headphones slipped off ears. Quiet conversations stopped mid-sentence. Two federal air marshals stood in the aisle beside seat 3A, their presence calm but unmistakably authoritative. One of them gestured politely. "Sir, please place your hands in front of you." Ellison looked from one marshal to the other. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't fearful either. It was the controlled calm of someone who had spent years inside courtrooms where emotions only complicated the truth. "Before I do that," he said evenly, "may I understand the reason for this request?" The second marshal spoke this time. A report was made about suspicious behavior. Around the cabin, murmurs began spreading quietly between passengers. Suspicious behavior. Several travelers exchanged confused looks. The businessman seated across the aisle leaned back slowly, staring at the scene unfolding in front of him. He had been watching the man in seat 3A for nearly an hour. Reading. Sitting quietly. Looking out the window. Nothing else. Ellison folded his hands loosely in front of him. "With respect," he said calmly, "I haven't done anything that could reasonably be interpreted as suspicious." "We are not here to debate that," the first marshal replied gently. "We are just following procedure." A few rows behind them, someone lifted a phone. Then another. Small red recording lights quietly appeared throughout the cabin. Passengers were documenting everything. The cabin had become an audience. Ellison noticed the phones, but he didn't react to them. Instead, he slowly placed his book down on the seat and stepped fully into the aisle. "Very well," he said. His voice remained calm, controlled. "If that's what you need to do." The first marshal removed a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click echoed louder than it should have in the quiet cabin. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned forward slightly. "This doesn't seem necessary," he said cautiously. The marshals didn't respond. Their focus remained on the man standing calmly in front of them. "Hands forward, sir." Ellison complied immediately. He extended his wrists. No resistance. No raised voice. Just quiet cooperation. The cuffs snapped closed. Several passengers gasped softly. One woman near the front whispered, "Oh my God." Phones continued recording. From the forward galley, Emily Carter watched everything unfold. Her arms were folded across her uniform jacket, her posture stiff but steady. In her mind, she had done exactly what she was trained to do. If something felt wrong, report it. And she had. Now security was handling the situation. One of the marshals gently guided Ellison toward the front of the cabin. "Sir, we are going to ask you a few questions." Ellison nodded. "Of course." As they moved him forward, passengers leaned into the aisle to watch. Some looked shocked. Others looked confused. A few looked deeply uncomfortable. The businessman across the aisle spoke again. "I've been sitting here the entire flight," he said firmly. "He hasn't done anything." One marshal glanced briefly toward him. "Sir, please remain seated." The businessman hesitated, then slowly leaned back in his seat. But he wasn't the only one paying attention. 3 rows back, a college student had been recording since the marshals first approached. Her camera stayed steady as Ellison was guided toward the galley area. "What exactly is the accusation?" she asked aloud. No one answered. Ellison remained composed as the marshals positioned him near the forward bulkhead. "Sir," one of them said, "we are going to ask you a few routine questions." Ellison nodded again. "Go ahead." "What is the purpose of your travel today?" "I'm returning to Washington after attending a legal conference in Geneva." "Occupation?" There was a brief pause. Ellison answered calmly. "I work in federal law." Behind the marshals, Emily watched carefully. Her expression didn't change. "What kind of federal law?" one marshal asked. Ellison looked directly at him. "I serve in the federal judiciary." The marshal frowned slightly. "What does that mean exactly?" Ellison's voice remained even. "I'm a United States federal judge." For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air without landing. Then the nearest passenger spoke quietly. "Wait, what?" One of the marshals glanced toward his partner. The second marshal studied Ellison more closely now. "Do you have identification?" Ellison nodded slowly. "Yes." "My wallet is in the inside pocket of my jacket." The marshals exchanged a quick look. Then one of them carefully reached into the pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. Inside was a federal identification card. The marshal opened it. His eyes moved across the printed name. Marcus Ellison, United States District Court. For the first time since the confrontation began, the marshal's posture shifted. Behind them, passengers leaned forward. Phones continued recording. And near the galley, Emily Carter's confident expression began to fade. Because the quiet passenger she had reported as suspicious was exactly who he said he was. For a moment, the entire front of the cabin fell into a stunned silence. The air marshal holding the identification card read the name again, slower this time, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less complicated. They didn't. Marcus Ellison, United States District Court. He lifted his eyes toward the man standing calmly in front of him, still handcuffed, still composed, still showing none of the anger most people would feel after being detained in front of an entire airplane. The second marshal leaned slightly closer to see the card. "You're a federal judge?" he asked. Ellison nodded once. "Yes." The marshal's jaw tightened slightly. Behind them, the quiet murmurs inside the cabin were growing louder. Passengers who had been whispering to each other now spoke openly. "Did he say judge?" "Federal judge." Phones were still raised. Cameras were still recording. Several passengers had captured the moment the cuffs snapped shut. Now they were capturing something else, the moment the situation began to unravel. The marshal holding the ID card exhaled slowly. "Sir, why didn't you mention that earlier?" Ellison's answer came without hesitation. "Because you didn't ask." A few passengers nearby let out quiet, stunned laughs at the simplicity of the response. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching since the beginning leaned forward again. "I told you," he said quietly but firmly. "He hasn't done anything this entire flight." The marshals exchanged another look. They both knew the situation had just become significantly more complicated. Carefully, one of them reached for the handcuffs. "Sir," he said quietly, "we are going to remove these." The metal ratcheted open. The cuffs slipped free from Ellison's wrists. He lowered his hands calmly, rubbing one wrist briefly before letting his arms fall to his sides. No anger. No raised voice. Just controlled patience. From the galley, Emily Carter watched the scene unfold with growing tension in her chest. This wasn't how she expected the situation to go. Passengers were now openly staring at her. Several of them had already connected the pieces. They had watched her earlier interactions with the passenger in seat 3A. They had seen the way she skipped his service, heard the question she asked. Now they were watching the result. One of the marshals turned toward her. "Miss Carter," he said. Every conversation in the cabin stopped again. Emily stepped forward slowly. "Yes. You were the one who reported the passenger." Her voice was noticeably quieter now. "Yes. What exactly did he do?" The question hung heavily in the air. Several passengers leaned slightly into the aisle to hear the answer. Emily hesitated. "He seemed suspicious." The marshal waited. "And?" "He was watching the cabin." A few passengers exchanged disbelieving looks. The businessman across the aisle spoke again. "He was reading a book." Another passenger added from behind. "That's literally all he did." A woman 2 rows back raised her phone slightly. "I've been recording since the marshals came up," she said. "He didn't resist or argue or anything." The marshal's expression grew more serious. He turned back toward Ellison. "Sir, I want to apologize for the inconvenience." Ellison adjusted the sleeve of his suit jacket calmly. "I understand that you were responding to a report." His tone remained measured. "But this situation could have been handled differently." "That's fair," the marshal admitted. Around the cabin, passengers were now openly discussing what had happened. Some shook their heads. Others continued filming. The college student who had been recording since the confrontation began quietly whispered to the person next to her. "This is definitely going online." And she wasn't the only one thinking it. Multiple passengers had captured clear footage of the arrest. The questioning. The moment the judge's identity was revealed. By the time the aircraft landed in Washington, those videos would already be spreading across social media. Inside the cabin, the marshals returned Ellison's identification. "Again, sir," one of them said, "we apologize for the situation." Ellison accepted the card and slipped it back into his wallet. "I appreciate that," he said. But the calm tone of his voice didn't erase the tension now hanging over the flight. Because while the handcuffs had been removed, the consequences of what had just happened were only beginning. Several passengers were already discussing filing witness statements. Others were preparing to upload their videos. And standing near the galley, Emily Carter could feel dozens of eyes on her. The quiet passenger she had reported was now the center of a story that was about to leave the airplane and reach the entire country. By the time the aircraft began its descent toward Washington, the atmosphere inside the cabin had completely changed. What had started as a quiet overnight flight had turned into something no one on board would soon forget. Judge Marcus Ellison had returned to his seat in 3A after the handcuffs were removed. The marshals had offered to relocate him or provide any assistance he might need, but he declined politely. "I'll remain where I am," he said. So he sat again beside the window, the same seat where the entire incident had begun. But now the cabin around him felt different. Passengers kept glancing toward him, some with sympathy, others with quiet admiration for how calmly he had handled the situation. A few people even nodded respectfully when he briefly looked up from his book. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned toward him once. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'm sorry that happened." Ellison offered a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you." A few rows back, phones were still out. Some passengers had already begun reviewing the footage they had captured, replaying the moment the marshals approached, the sound of the cuffs snapping shut, the conversation that followed. And most importantly, the moment the identification card came out. Several people exchanged knowing looks. This was not going to stay inside the airplane. Near the front galley, Emily Carter stood silently while the two air marshals spoke with the captain over the internal communication line. Their conversation was brief but serious. Standard protocol in situations like this required documentation. Reports would need to be filed. Statements taken. Every detail reviewed. When the marshals finished speaking with the cockpit, one of them turned toward Emily. "We are going to need a full report from you once we land," he said calmly. Emily nodded, though the confidence she carried earlier in the flight was gone. "Of course." The marshal studied her for a moment. "What exactly made you believe the passenger posed a security concern?" Emily hesitated. "I just had a feeling." The marshal's expression hardened slightly. A feeling isn't normally enough to trigger a security response. Emily didn't answer. Behind them, several passengers had clearly overheard the exchange. One of them shook his head quietly. Meanwhile, in seat 3A, Judge Allison closed his book again and looked out the window as the aircraft descended through thick layers of cloud. City lights slowly appeared below them, thousands of glowing points stretching across the dark landscape. Washington, D.C. Home. But this return would be very different from the quiet arrival he had expected hours earlier. Because while the aircraft was still in the air, the story had already begun spreading beyond it. A passenger seated near the rear of the cabin had connected to the plane's limited Wi-Fi service and uploaded a short clip to social media. The video was only 40 seconds long. It showed the marshals approaching seat 3A, the calm passenger standing, the handcuffs closing, and then the moment someone said the words, "He's a federal judge." Within minutes, the clip began circulating. By the time the aircraft's wheels touched the runway at Dulles International Airport, thousands of people had already seen it. Inside the cabin, the landing gear lowered with a loud mechanical hum. Passengers straightened their seats and secured their belongings. But the normal end-of-flight routine had been replaced by a strange, watchful silence. Everyone knew something bigger was about to happen. The aircraft touched down smoothly. Applause usually followed landings like this, especially after long international flights. Tonight, there was none. Instead, the cabin remained quiet as the plane rolled toward the gate. The marshals remained standing near the front. Emily stayed in the galley, avoiding eye contact with the passengers who now looked at her very differently than they had when they boarded. When the aircraft finally reached the gate, the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime. But no one stood immediately. Through the small cabin window near the door, flashing blue lights became visible on the tarmac. Airport security vehicles. Inside the cabin, passengers slowly began to realize what that meant. This situation wasn't over. Not even close. The door opened. And within moments, several officials stepped onto the aircraft to begin reviewing exactly what had happened during the flight. The night was thick with tension as Judge Allison stepped into the diner, his eyes scanning every corner. The memory of the arrest earlier still burned, a sharp reminder that appearances could deceive even the most careful observers. He moved past the startled patrons, who now whispered and pointed, their curiosity mixing with unease. At the counter, Anthony leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. "You really thought I wouldn't notice you, Judge?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. There was no malice, only the cold precision of someone who thrived on testing limits. Ellison didn't flinch. His calm was deliberate, a shield forged over years of courtroom battles and quiet observation. Anthony's gaze flicked to the badge that had caused the earlier confusion. "Funny thing," he muttered, "authority can be a double-edged sword." He leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Ellison. "Some people wield it. Some people get crushed by it." Ellison's hand hovered near the counter, not in aggression but in readiness. Every movement was calculated, every pause, deliberate. The diner seemed to shrink around them, the murmurs of patrons fading into a tense silence. In that space, it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a test, an unspoken challenge of who held the real power when law and force collided. Without another word, Ellison turned, moving toward the exit with the measured pace of a man who had already won 1,000 silent battles. Anthony watched, the smirk fading into a sharp recognition of respect, begrudging but real. Outside, the night swallowed the judge, leaving behind a diner still buzzing with whispered questions, and the lingering question of who was really in control. The rain hit the streets like a warning, slick and relentless, as Ellison walked with steady purpose. Every shadow seemed to shift, every passerby a potential complication. He wasn't just a judge tonight. He was a target, a man whose identity had already sparked fear, curiosity, and danger in equal measure. Anthony appeared at the curb, leaning against a streetlight. "You think they'll stop?" he asked, voice cutting through the rain. His grin was sharper now, less teasing, more knowing. Ellison didn't answer. Words were unnecessary. The weight of the moment spoke louder. Sirens wailed in the distance, a reminder that authority was never far behind, but not all authority carried the same fear. Ellison's eyes scanned the streets, noting exits, potential threats, the rhythm of movement around him. Each step was deliberate, each glance a strategy. Anthony stepped beside him. "Funny, isn't it?" he said quietly. "How power works. Some flaunt it. Some survive it." Ellison simply nodded. Tonight, survival wasn't about law books or badges. It was about instinct, timing, and the invisible edge between control and chaos. A figure darted from an alley, and Ellison's hand moved almost automatically. Anthony's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a silent warning. But the threat dissolved as quickly as it appeared. A courier, lost in the storm, oblivious to the tension surrounding them. Ellison exhaled, letting the moment pass. Yet the streets whispered truths he couldn't ignore. The city hadn't forgotten who he was, and neither had the danger that lingered just out of sight. Tonight was a reminder. Even a judge could walk among shadows, but only if he kept his wits sharper than anyone else's.